Thank you for doing this, bringing us together. And Pragna, fantastic that you're with us again today. It is my pleasure to help facilitate today's chat from Old Cap, and specifically to introduce our special guest, Pragna Soni. Receiving her JD in 1997 and graduating with distinction, Pragna serves as Deputy Chief for the Department's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section. She supervises the investigation and prosecution of violent crimes that happen outside of the United States, where the United States has jurisdiction. She served in several other roles inside the Department of Justice, including as a trial attorney and general counsel. Previously, she also worked as an attorney for 2 private firms in the Washington, D.C. area. During her time at the University of Iowa Law, she was a founding member and worked as the technical editor of the Journal of Gender and, I'm sorry, I have that, excuse me, there it is, a Journal of Gender, Race and Justice. Pragna, I was telling you a little bit earlier, it's a little hard to believe it's been 2 years since we last connected, and sitting down with you and having coffee in Washington, D.C. and getting to know you. But since that time, and in subsequent meetings, certainly with our alumni engagement team, it's clear that you do have a significant story to tell. And so for our audience members that are here today, I'm going to be asking Pragna a series of questions that focus on different themes. The themes of when she was here at the University of Iowa, her career, and certainly her current role. So in the spirit of that framework, I'm ready if you are, Pragna.
I am. Duff, thank you for that lovely introduction. And yes, it's very hard for me to believe that 2 years have gone by like, well, as they have. And I'm looking forward to having our conversation today and to catching up with you.
Fantastic. Well, I tell you what, let's go not quite back to the beginning, but nearly back to the beginning. If you would, tell the group here just where you're originally from and how you decided that the University of Iowa was your destination.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. We'll start at the beginning. So I actually grew up in New Jersey. I was born in London. My parents are from India, so definitely, sort of the full immigration experience for my parents. But I spent all my time growing up in New Jersey and a lot of my time at the Jersey Shore because I'm a beach girl. And so it made complete sense, didn't it, that I would end up in a landlocked state for law school. And
Exactly.
You're freezing just a bit. I hope I'm not, but you're freezing just a bit, Duff, just FYI.
All right, you're good. I think you're good.
All right, great. I went to undergrad at Colgate University, and after I left Colgate, I moved to DC with a good friend. And my first job was as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, a very large law firm. And somebody who became very quickly a very, very good friend, he, I believe his father or his, people in his family were alums of Iowa. So at the time that I started thinking about applying to law school, and even though associates and partners tried to talk us out of it, I still went down that path. And he would come by my office, and I am not kidding, I believe he would leave livestock reports on my desk. And he was lobbying for me to apply, to come out there with him because he did know he was going there. Am I allowed to call anybody out by name? I'm happy to throw his name out there. Anyway, I was not intending to apply, but I did. I applied. I was like, well, we'll see. I had researched the school. It was, a top 20 law school. It got excellent reviews. But what actually probably really drew me in is I thought, oh, maybe I'll get a master's in English at the same time, because English had been my undergraduate. Math, philosophy, and English had been my undergraduate majors. So I got in, and then they made it a much sweeter offer, and they offered me a scholarship. And suddenly I was packing all of my stuff and driving through the long state of Pennsylvania and et cetera to find myself in Iowa. And it was
well, and that was clearly an exciting time. clearly an exciting time. You're writing a new chapter in your life. You have these great expectations when you're traveling, as you said, through Pennsylvania. And yes, I agree.
A
it can
long,
be
long state of Pennsylvania.
Yes. But talk about your first impression then. You were arriving on campus. Was it everything that you thought, or maybe and more? Just curious about those first impressions.
So, I think one of the things that really encapsulate my sort of first feeling about my first impression of Iowa was that I remember very early on when I just moved there that I came to a stop sign. And for some reason, it was, nobody was moving. And I think there was a sort of an elderly person just sort of sitting there. And what felt like an enormous amount of time went by and nobody honked. And that is just not the case in DC. If you blink, you will start hearing that you haven't moved yet. And I was so tempted to honk, and yet I didn't. I resisted. And that is when I knew that I was no longer inside the Beltway, and that I was happy about that fact because people were just taking a little bit more time to do whatever it was that they were doing. And it was actually a pleasure to feel that and to also be outside the Beltway. So that was one of my first impressions that I never forget.
Love that. That is not what I expected to hear. That is a great story. In fact, I think it happened yesterday. So talk about with the College of Law in particular. I would imagine, in the time that you were there, there was a significant number of professors that have left indelible marks on our graduates. Did you have one of those favorite professors or two that really stood out?
Oh yeah, I definitely had favorites. Gene Love and Pat Kane were two favorites. They were also, Pat Kane was pretty involved in helping to set up the journal. I'm going to forget the name of the professor with whom I took critical race theory, which has now become a very controversial thing. But at the time, it was not so controversial in some ways, and he was excellent. And I'm trying to remember other particular classes. Now, I will admit, I have definitely blocked out some law school classes that were more challenging than others. So I'm struggling to remember other professors. Oh, I cannot remember the name of the professor who taught comparative international constitutional law, but that was an excellent class. So that's escaping me at the moment. But one of the things that was the draw is that the professors had already read materials that were, that they had really drawn an amazing array of professors from sort of all over with diverse backgrounds. And so I was really excited about the professors when I got there.
So, and I appreciate you sharing some of those specific names. Talk about, especially you mentioned this last class with international law. Clearly, those were pieces that led to your career as it is. But talk about how Iowa law perhaps helped prepare you for that career, got you off on that right track.
Well, this is going to sound basic, but one of the most important things about that the law school was doing at the time was their the mandatory writing and sort of trial advocacy program. And so, the writing that you were required to do in the small sections was really important, because one of the things that I continue to see sort of over and over again now in a supervisory role, and as part of my supervisory role, I also manage the entire intern program in our office, is that that you can tell sort of which schools have a really strong writing program, and whatever else you may learn later on, sort of substantively in the law, that's a big foundational basis. And I also love that we had a writing center. You could, I don't know if it still exists, but at the law school, you could bring your brief up and they would only look at it for writing quality and for, organization and, how well you do your analysis, not the substantive issues, but whether your work holds together. And I actually became a tutor in that, in the writing center. And I think those two things were sort of really great foundational things to my legal career. And then, of course, I can talk about, the many things that came from trying to assist and start. There was like a group of fabulous first years that worked to start the journal. That process was also a really great bedrock sort of thinking about how can you change a system or an environment that has sort of functioned in one way for a very long time, and you want to sort of introduce some new element into it that can make it richer. And so, the journals that existed at the law school at that time had been there for quite a while, and the question of whether this journal should be allowed to become a part of that fabric actually was more controversial than you might think. And so that process really created a foundation for sort of the things that I would take on that might later on that might not be easy, or that would require sort of reorienting people to the need to do something different at times. And so that was a great foundational basis. And then Fed Courts with Gene Love, I had no idea how critical that class would become. And evidence, which I did poorly in, or not poorly, but just mediocre. that became critical to the career that I had. So I'd say it's a combination of just excellent foundational skills, some really great opportunities to really step outside of just a traditional law school role, a student role, and then some excellent classes that became absolutely part of my career later.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing all of that. I appreciate that. And so, yes, you talk about the involvement with the College of Law and the different ways that different courses in the journal, certainly. So now you're graduating and you're taking on that first job right out of college. What was that first job right out of college, and what did you love about it, and maybe what were some of the struggles with it?
So my first job right out of college, or my first job right out of law school? You mean law school?
Yes. Let's go there.
So I love to tell this story because every time an intern walks in the door into our office, I want to start by reassuring them that if you don't have a job after law school, all is not lost. So I spent 2 summers in law school working for public interest organizations. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed with law firms at the school, in fact, and also in Chicago and elsewhere. And I didn't get an offer. I don't think I was what they were looking for, I think, in some ways, because I don't know, we talk about that later, but yeah, so I don't think those interviews went the greatest, right? In any case, I did not have a job offer after I left law school. And so I was thinking I was going to go to Chicago because it was sort of the closest market that knew Iowa well. And then I changed my mind because all of my friends and family were on the East Coast, and I had friends in DC, and I thought, there's so many attorneys in DC, you literally cannot throw a rock without hitting one. And so I think that's probably a better market to go back to. So I returned to DC. I had no job. I took loans. I studied for the bar, and I worked at Ann Taylor at the time, which when I can't say what I'm going to say next, but I really liked the clothes at that time. And I said to myself, if I don't have a job after I take the bar by September 1st, well, I'm going to temp. I'm going to become a temp attorney, because that was kind of a thing then. And, they were always looking for temp attorneys to do document review, which is brutally dull, but it pays the bills. So I did not have a job by the time I got to September. And so I started working at a temp firm. The first place they placed me was a law firm that did employment and Title VII work. And so I started temping at that firm, and then within 3 months they hired me. So that is how I got my first job.
Fantastic. We'll talk about Ann Taylor later then.
What's that?
We can talk about the Ann Taylor gig later then. So
yeah, we absolutely can. I think what it says is that you should not, you don't know, you think you have to have a path from the moment you leave.
Yeah.
But one of the things I've definitely learned is that even if you think you have a path, the path of your career is a very organic thing. As much as you want to try and control exactly where you're going to land next, I don't think it's always possible.
Yeah. Appreciate you sharing the takeaways of that and the lessons learned. So part of when we were talking with your introduction, you've worked in both the private sector, but also for the government. So practicing in state and federal courts. And so I was wondering if you could share with this group a little more about the similarities with those two, but also the contrast that might exist.
Yeah. So, well, let me start by saying this. Private practice was a good place to stop because it gives you a whole other set of skills about things like client service and recognizing that, that somebody else, you're working for a mission that is not necessarily yours, but it is a mission of sort of the firm, and what's in the client's best interest is sort of what you're after. But I knew very early on that private practice wasn't for me. I don't think in 6 minutes. I love, people do it really well. I don't, which is that I can't sort of contain myself in 6-minute increments. I can't not spend a lot of time trying to learn something. And if you do, it just means you're going to spend many, many more hours there making your billable hours. And so it wasn't for me. Now, I enjoyed Title VII and employment discrimination work a lot. But I knew pretty much from the moment I stepped into a private firm that I was going to go to the government, because the Department of Justice always had an allure and a draw. And so, the movement from private practice to federal was not that big into my first federal job, because I was working as a general counsel. My first job was working as a general counsel in the executive office for U.S. attorneys at the department. And that job is very much like being in-house counsel. And I was doing Title VII work. So there were a lot of similarities early on. But then it really diverged from private practice when at a certain point during my career, very early, there was a assistant deputy attorney general who was our liaison with my office and the United States attorney's offices around the country. And we came in to see him one day, and he was a storied gentleman who had helped set up the organized crime and gangs and the task force where they had been going after La Cosa Nostra and other, mob families from DC. And he'd been a part of that. And he walked around the room of this set of civil attorneys who were in-house counsel at the department and said, "You can't have a career in the department unless you're a criminal prosecutor." It was kind of a little bit jarring because none of us were criminal prosecutors, and we're like, well, what are we doing here? But at that point, I shifted my career to becoming a criminal prosecutor. And that's where things really diverge, because your mission is sort of not your client, which is what it was in private practice. And it was not what it was when I was general counsel, where my client was the U.S. attorneys around the country. It shifted entirely to your job. Your mission is to to the community. Your mission is to is to vindicate the rights of victims and to carry out the mission of the department. And that was a very big shift, because suddenly it was much larger than sort of a client, a firm. It was the concept of doing justice in a much larger like I'm saying mission, but that's sort of really what it comes back to.
Yeah.
And that was a great shift for me, because it really created sort of meaning around the work I was doing in a different kind of way. And then also, there's no sort of luxury in government practice to have many layers of supervision. And so you start doing things a lot sooner. You're in court a lot faster than you would be in private practice in a large firm. And so you learn a lot of skills very quickly that might take many years perhaps to sort of develop in private practice. And so there's definitely some places like that where it diverged considerably from from private practice.
So you're just talking about in the role that you were playing, it was more about the prosecution of crimes that were maybe local, Washington D.C. But how did you get into, and you talked about the bigger picture, how did you get into the even bigger picture of the international violent crimes? That seems to be a whole other bite of the apple. I'm curious if you can share more about or what you can share about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't even think I knew what international violent crime meant before I sort of ended up in this role. So when I was in the general counsel's office at the department, we were doing only civil work in that capacity. But when I realized that, I was being led down this road of thinking about becoming a prosecutor, I spent 7 months in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. And that is, as you said, local crime, because in D.C., there's sort of no local DA. The DA is the federal prosecutor. So I did, you do domestic violence, you do all of those things. And really, the focus of most domestic crime, as people who are that are attorneys know, or others who might not, is that you commit a crime in Iowa City, you're going to be prosecuted, by the local prosecutor or the local DA because the crime happened there. Most crimes are governed by sort of venue issues. Where did the crime happen? But there are a number of statutes that allow the federal government to reach crimes occurring extraterritorially in other places. And I didn't really know about that world until I got my first criminal job at the department. And that was with a section called the domestic security section. Their portfolio was a little bit of a jumble because they had just merged with a couple of other sections. But basically it was complex immigration crimes, which were attempts by organized criminals to smuggle people into the United States. And this was an issue for two reasons. One, it created vulnerabilities to potentially allowing people into the United States that might be seeking to do us harm. Remember, this was created post 9/11, so that makes sense, but also potentially to address humanitarian concerns. So these people that would smuggle large numbers of people in the United States, they often did that in the back of like a large truck where people would suffocate. So the focus of that portfolio was to address those issues. But that crime is occurring elsewhere, right? The smugglers are bringing people in from other countries. So the crime is actually occurring elsewhere in some way, but there is actually jurisdiction over that under our statutes. The second portfolio that section handled was the substantive human rights offenses, which is genocide, war crimes, torture, crimes like that. And I can talk more about that in a minute. And then the third was these sort of statutes that applied extraterritorially for crimes that happened elsewhere, but which we were allowed to prosecute back here in the United States because Congress said we could. So these would be things like murders and rapes happening on embassy grounds in other countries, our US embassy grounds, or perhaps a murder of a US national abroad by another US national. Or a third example would be, the murder of a US government employee abroad. And so the reason we could reach those crimes is because there was some kind of nexus, right, to the interests of the United States. Now, just because we can prosecute a crime here doesn't mean that the other country is going to let us have the evidence, have the defendant, any of those things potentially. But that is at least how we could reach into those countries and say, yeah, we're going to prosecute that person back here in the United States. So that section was the first section I started with. And the first case I worked on was a torture case involving Chucky Taylor, who was the son of the Liberian president, Charles Taylor, who we ultimately prosecuted for torture in this country, and who is now serving a 90-something year sentence. That section then merged with another section, and I apologize for this long discussion, but a section called the OSI, which were known as Nazi hunters. Their job was to find people who had come to the United States after World War II, who had lied on their immigration forms and who may have then therefore been involved in sort of the atrocities during World War II. They merged our section with that section, and we became the Human Rights and Special Prosecution section. But the portfolios remain the same, and we still do all three of those portfolios today.
So, Pragna, I'm going to go.
That's a lot, I know.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and just admit to you and our listeners today, I had some great questions, or so I thought, but you've really surfaced so many more topics that I know that there's going to be some folks that have questions. And so this is actually quite brilliant. I mean, you talked about those pressing issues of being immigration, humanitarian rights, and also you talked substantive is the word that you used with human rights. One of the things I wanted to maybe have you share a little bit more about is the how is it different with the domestic violent crimes versus how you're prosecuting perhaps international.
Yeah.
You just said some countries may not have that interest in prosecution like some others do. And so maybe it depends on the country, maybe it depends on their court system. That I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Doug, because this is where it gets really, really complicated. Our ability as working with, our law enforcement partners, and our law enforcement partners in my office are FBI, NC, a lot of the military entities like NCIS, Army CID, and I can explain why later. And also State Department's Office of Special Investigations, special agents. Their ability to investigate in another country is going to vary widely from place to place, depending on what kind of relationship we have with the country. And our ability to obtain evidence that is in that, that's in that country or present in that country is a substantially difficult process potentially. It may involve mutual legal assistance treaties, all kinds of sort of main government to government requests. Our ability to obtain a defendant is going to be potentially governed by extradition treaties. So everything that would be simpler in the United States if it was just a sex assault here, and I don't mean just a sex assault in any sort of, minimizing my, becomes incredibly more complicated when you're dealing potentially with, crimes occurring abroad. So, I'm trying to think of a good example, but we have to cooperate immediately with local law enforcement a lot of the time, because we may show up to a crime scene, but hey, it's their country. They don't have to let us in, right? If the crime scene is not on U.S. Embassy grounds, and if we have to, negotiate even on U.S. Embassy grounds, it's possible that local law enforcement might respond. So that's the first thing. Like, at the very get-go, it's going to be like, what is your relationship? What is the relationship of our agents with local law enforcement? Because that can make a huge difference. If they have a good relationship, if they're cooperative, if they can do things cop to cop and be informal, we're going to get that evidence much better. We're also at the mercy of, if they grab the defendant first and, they talk to him and they don't give him rights, what are we stuck with? So yeah, it gets incredibly complex. And I would say this in sort of summary fashion. It is a product of personal relationships with the local law enforcement, our ability to obtain things at a more formal level when we need the evidence, and actually a lot of relationships that I build from our section with prosecutors in other countries, with the people on the ground in other countries, like regional security officers at the embassy, and then with our our agents everywhere in the world, because I work with the entire military criminal investigative structure, because they refer matters to us all the time for matters that are happening involving civilians accompanying the Department of Defense abroad. So it's a really, there's so many places to talk about it, but you're right, it's quite complex and it requires a lot of cooperation with foreign governments and foreign law enforcement.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. We've got, we have some questions that have come in. I'll get to those in just a moment. And certainly, folks, if you have questions for Pragna, please post those in the Q&A and we will get to those. One of the perhaps more final questions I might have for you, Pragna, is I can just imagine what this was like for you pre-pandemic, when you had different countries would have different rules about, are they shutting down, are they not? And now pandemic, this is virtual. I don't know, I can't imagine that has actually made your job easier. I would imagine it's more difficult, to be quite honest, but I'm wondering, when this started to happen, how did you look at this, and how did you approach what you needed to do in these other countries?
Yeah, it got really challenging really fast. I mean, that's an understatement for every single person who's probably listening, right? Because everybody's life got really hard really fast in some ways. But trying to ensure accountability for crimes committed abroad definitely got challenging. And here's some of the immediate things that were going to be immediate challenges that were going to be obvious to everybody. Nobody could travel. Our criminal investigators couldn't travel. People had started shutting down access, right, for who could come into a country, who could leave a country, what the requirements were going to be for quarantine. And so, for example, there's one portfolio in the International Violent Crime portfolio. We have one set of statutes called the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. That statute allows us to remove people that are accompanying the Department of Defense abroad and commit a crime, because there's in that capacity, we can immediately remove them from another country without using extradition, right? The problem is your U.S. Marshals cannot go there and pick up that guy, or that gal who just committed the crime. What are we going to do if there is like an immediate, let's say, a contractor on Misawa Air Base in Japan stabs another contractor? These are both, DoD contractors. The MPs are going to take that person into custody, and then they're going to call me and say, okay, we got him, and you need to remove them under MIJA. And we're going to say, we can't send a marshal. We can't get anybody out there. So immediately the immediate question became, how are we going to investigate? And, what are we going to do to get our agents in and out of these areas? And it did, in fact, happen. We ended up having to do a removal during the pandemic. It was incredibly complex. And you need quarantine on both sides. And, and the courts aren't going to let you do that for so long. The other big thing is all the courts were shut down. And so, things like you need to get that defendant before the judge in X amount of days from an international environment back here became even more complicated because there's nobody sitting for, you can't even indict people for a long time. And a lot of the federal courts around the country, you couldn't indict anybody. You had to move by complaint. And then, if you need to actually detain them, you had even bigger issues. And so, yeah, we had a lot of challenges, but I'd say the initial ones were like, oh my God, if a crime happens, I don't know how we're going to investigate it. I don't know how we're going to investigate it.
And the example that you just gave there, one of our audience members had a question regarding the impact for your ability to work with international governments, and was there an example? And you shared a perfect example of that. But another question that has come in that I thought would be a good one to ask, and so international conflict is a common topic in the film industry. Is there a movie that you've seen that maybe represents some of the work that you do? And I would imagine a lot of it's behind the scenes, but I don't know if you're a movie buff or not, but if there's a movie that maybe depicts some of the role that you play.
Wow, that's a super tough question. And I'm a huge movie buff. And now I'm going to have to search, before when you could watch movies back in those old days. But actually in another place other than in your pajamas. I'm trying to think, is there a movie that represents this role very well?
The one I was thinking of, Pragna, and again, with the question that came in, I could be way off base. I was thinking of Argo. If you've seen the Argo movie, which I believe it starred Ben Affleck.
Yeah, I saw.
Situation where I think it was in the
late 70s, right? They're
Yes.
trying to get the folks out of Iran, I believe, right?
That's right. And they were held for 444 days, I believe.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that is that was definitely behind the scenes. Obviously, this was more of an action packed, and so they're dramatizing it obviously for us.
I wish I could say that there was that much sort of excitement, and that was definitely, I think, right, a CIA or an agency operation, if I'm remembering correctly, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm trying to think of something as mundane as a crime that occurs in another country that's captured in film and how we dealt with it here, but I can't think of anything like that. No, listen, definitely we have our overlap with the intelligence community, but I cannot think of anything nearly that exciting that I can think of that's been converted into a movie that would be helpful as an example. You know what? I'll tell you this. It's really more like this. It's really more like one of those Lifetime movies where, we have a bunch of cases called 1119 cases. And inevitably in one of these Lifetime movies, some person who's just been engaged or just married to another person, they go away to Aruba or Bali or someplace else, and one spouse murders the other, right? I don't know, for some great reason, like to get all their money or to, continue an affair, and then they come back here. So it's like a Lifetime movie, because then we decide whether we can prosecute that person here for having killed their spouse elsewhere. So it's a little bit more like that.
Having a conversation with you, the way you talk about it's just so, it can be overwhelming for someone that doesn't deal with this on a daily basis, right? And you clearly deal with this on a very regular basis. So one of the questions that came in, what does a typical day look like for you?
It's okay. So it's a little bit hard to say, right? Because whenever you work in a reactive place, and the international violent crime portfolio among all three of ours is very reactive, which means it responds to crimes happening, right? As opposed to large scale investigations that are going on in the other portfolios where we sort of target people to investigate. So it's reactive in the sense that I get calls all day long from FBI, from the DS, OSI people at State Department, and from the military investigators saying, this just happened, what do we do? You know, this just happened, do we have jurisdiction? I get a lot of telephone calls, and we do a lot of that kind of sort of intake and processing. And in some places we would sort of, feed that out to attorneys, and we're sort of doing a little bit of that now, but a lot of it requires expertise. So we'll get calls also from U.S. attorneys' offices around the country saying, no, we don't know. Can we do something with this? So they're looking for our guidance, like things happening on cruise ships, things happening on airplanes. So we do a lot. We have a lot of expertise in house. So I do a lot of that, a lot of talking and providing guidance. I also supervise, a team of attorneys that are actually litigating the cases. We're not just a main justice section that doesn't actually prosecute. As most people who kind of are in the business that are attorneys on the line or watching might know, the U.S. attorney's offices are generally around the country. They're actually prosecuting the cases in their district. And a lot of main justice people are often like, approving stuff or, consulting, but not actually prosecuting. That's not true in our office. We actually prosecute the cases in the districts around the country with our AUSA partners. So I'm also supervising all these people, reading pleadings. We're getting ready to, do moots for trial. All of those things are also happening at the same time. So it's kind of a combination of, talking to all of our law enforcement partners, working with our trial attorneys. We also do policy work. So we also are looking at legislation that we want to try and, fix because something's gone wrong in terms of the portfolios that we are looking at. So recently there was new legislation about a statute called 1117, which is trying to murder U.S. employees abroad. The D.C. Circuit had decided that statute did not apply abroad, and it's critical, right, to our law enforcement being able to function in an international environment. That if they're targeted, we should be able to do something. So Congress just passed that recently, and we had some involvement in that. So it's a good time to say, as a caveat, sort of everything I'm talking about here is really sort of from my own viewpoint, and it's sort of not attributed to our office or to the department, but I'm happy to talk about my experiences here. So sorry, that every lawyer knows I had to give some kind of caveat or liability statement.
Sure.
Right?
Well, I've got two questions that remain, and of course, if other questions pop in, we can certainly host those. One of the questions that just popped in is with the role that you're playing with the team of individuals that you work in partnership with. How much of your role involves international travel to be a part of these cases? And is there, I imagine it's going to be different in every case as far as the time frame that's expected. I was just wondering if you might share an example of that.
Yeah, I've got a couple. It's different. When I was on the line, which means I was a trial attorney in our office, it was a completely different animal. So, in some really sensitive cases that happen abroad, the case could, the referral would come in that the crime has just occurred, and we'd be dispatching one of our trial attorneys to head out to Thailand or to head out in order to help investigate, to be there at the same time as the investigation was unfolding. And that can be pretty critical because, a lot of the witnesses may be, nationals of that country. And the crime scene might quickly become unavailable because the local authorities decide that you're not going to get it for long. And the witness might not even be a U.S. national. So we would send off our trial attorneys pretty quickly. So there was a case of a rape of a housekeeper by a embassy employee, and I was pretty much in that country, within a week of it happening or less to work that case. And so, that kind of travel can happen frequently, especially depending on the difficulty, the seriousness, the likelihood that we're going to lose evidence. So our trial attorneys do travel quite frequently to sort of international locations. And then there's some more, planned out travel, like on our human rights side of the house. As I said, we have these more targeted investigations. Well, they may go and spend a week in an African country to, meet with witnesses from a crime that occurred, 20 years ago, over which we still have jurisdiction, and so there can be that sort of more planned travel. In my function now, most of my travel is either domestic to check out where the trials are happening from the international crimes that have occurred, or if I do travel internationally, like I did right before the pandemic, I was in Germany to do a presentation to law enforcement agents on international violent crime. So now sort of my international travel is either going to be sort of more in that realm, less sort of there to investigate the case, more to do a training, meet with, international counterparts, things like that.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, final question, Pragna, and we'll let you get back to your day. What would you say? What would you like the general public, and in this case, the folks that are with us today, what is it that you would like us to know, and what, if anything, can we do?
Well, I think it's so I think it's an interesting question to say, what can we do? And I've been thinking about this question a lot. Sort of like, what impact does any person sort of have on this extraterritorial portfolio that we have? And I want to start sort of a little bit backwards and say this: the mission of our office is one of accountability. Every one of our portfolios is looking to hold people doing bad acts accountable. In the international violent crime portfolio, one level of our accountability is like, look, we've sent off our embassy employees and our military, people that are supporting our military, into other countries. And we expect them to behave, and to represent our country well and not to do bad acts there. And so statutes that we have that, sort of punish bad acts by, for example, people supporting the military, is about accountability. Like, the United States is going to hold accountable the people it sends around the world, or people that seek to do harm to U.S. nationals. We're going to hold those people accountable. We do the same thing in our human rights portfolio, right? Our human rights portfolio, its jurisdiction is a little bit more limited than perhaps other countries, but we're seeking to hold people that come into this country, lie on immigration forms perhaps, and have done bad acts in other countries. Well, we're going to hold them accountable for those bad acts, and we're going to hold them accountable for lying on those forms. And the reason I sort of stress this accountability issue is because that is the mission of our office, and accountability only has value and meaning if we are adhering and respecting sort of the underlying tenet of criminal law, which is that respect for the rule of law, right? That is a recognition that all people are going to be treated the same under the law, that things like corruption undermine the rule of law and undermine democratic norms. And so, because if you expect accountability in this portfolio and in our international, crimes that happen to or by American nationals abroad, if that is going to be the sort of underlying theme that we care about at the Department of Justice, then we have to strengthen our democratic institutions, because they underlie removing corruption, they underlie the issues of accountability. And what that means at a local level, I think, is that everybody should be holding their local politicians, their local government accountable, but really also they should be instilling faith in those institutions, because if we don't have faith in our institutions, it sort of is a house of cards. There's no such thing as accountability. There's no such thing as the rule of law. And so I think it's about in your local world, creating, cultivating, belief and trust in those institutions, whatever that takes. And I think that's broken down too a little bit, which is people in their local communities having sort of a belief that their government institutions are designed or should be doing things in their best interest. So that's a little bit abstract, I know, but I think it starts local, like talking to your friends and family about having belief in your local institutions, in your federal institutions. And if you don't, how do you recreate that? Because that's what underlies the rule of law.
Appreciate
That was
that.
complicated. I apologize.
No, not at
I
all.
probably put
Thank
people to sleep before lunch for that one.
We asked the question. We asked the question. Pragna, thank you for spending this time with us today. I really do appreciate your replies and the answers and the difference that you're making on a daily basis, and really do appreciate you spending time with the folks that joined us today. Thank you very much. And this is going to end our meeting, but Pragna, thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And, you know, my journey really does start both with law school and with college. And my journey started to this position very much at Iowa, and the fantastic, I mean, I have to say, not just my professors, you know, my classmates have done some amazing, amazing things since we left law school. But, you know, their impact on me, in addition to the school and really even the campus, like I made a big effort to apologize, but to get out of the law school side of the campus and back into the undergrad. So I lived on that side for 3 years. And just sort of being in that world sort of recalibrates you to what is outside the beltway and what really matters. And so anyway, Iowa's been a big part of my journey to that point. And I just want to thank you all for having me today. It was great to see everybody, even in this environment. And then let's do this again someday in person.
Absolutely.